It's the week ending Saturday the 6th of April, and this is The Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've seen 7 aid workers killed in Gaza following an Israeli airstrike, a 7.4 magnitude earthquake hitting Taiwan, the worst in 25 years, and J.K. Rowling offering herself up for arrest after posting controversial messages about trans women. You can read all you need to know about everything that matters in The Week magazine, but we're here to bring you some stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news, not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Olly Mann, and let's unwrap the week. And joining me today from the week's digital team is Julia O'Driscoll. From Today in History with the Retrospectors, my favourite daily podcast, it's Arion McNicoll, and we have writer and performer Suchandrika Chakrabarti as well. And it's officially British summertime, although you wouldn't know it from looking out the window. Do the clocks spring forward in Australia, Arion? Is that even a thing?
Yeah, we go in the opposite direction. So, winter's closing in on us. The days are short. I'm in my warmest T-shirt.
That's how you wrap up.
Yep.
Yeah. So jealous. Julia, you're up first. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
Will a political row over a tiny island sway the world's biggest election?
An RTI, as you know, was filed by Mr. Annamalai, and this is not about a small island or a big island about 1 mile long or 300 yards. I think the important part that we need to understand is whether it's thorny shrubs or just fishermen or just vegetation is not the point. This is land that belongs to India. Now, if you have the so-called Congress government being so disinterested and insensitive in protecting Indian territory, then I think it raises a lot of questions.
Shana NC from India's BJP party speaking to the Times of India on Sunday. Julia, what island is she talking about and why?
So she's talking about the island of Chakrabarti, which is a tiny uninhabited island in the sea between Sri Lanka and India. And the island itself has quite a long and complicated history, but what's important to know is that from 1974, it's been a Sri Lankan territory. But it's made the news this week because of a report by the Times of India, which has cited documents quoting former Prime Minister and head of the Congress Party of India, basically saying that before Sri Lanka took control of the territory, India wasn't fussed about trying to retain it for itself, and it was happy to pass it over to the Sri Lankan government.
So what? Why is that a problem? I mean, they all seem to have been happy with that arrangement for 50 years.
So in the 50 years since, it's actually been quite a contentious issue. But the reason that it's really come to the fore now is that as India is about to go to the polls in general elections later this month, the current Prime Minister, Narendra Modi, who's head of the BJP party, is trying to use this report and this historical stance as a way of criticising the opposition Congress party and saying that they can't be trusted.
They gave it away. They'll do it again with one of the other islands Sri Lanka
Exactly.
Forgive me, I didn't know it was a contentious issue. Arion, was it really? And if so, why?
Yeah, so political parties in Tamil Nadu have regularly raised the issue of Chakrabarti and filed cases in court challenging the agreement with Sri Lanka. 2 of those cases are currently heading towards the Supreme Court, but basically fishermen and women in Tamil Nadu are often being arrested by Sri Lankan authorities when they stray into Sri Lankan waters, including those around Chakrabarti, so the issue often makes headlines there. I mean, the real question is whether the BJP is actually going to do anything about this, because even though India's Foreign Minister S.J. Shankar held a press conference saying that the issue had been hidden too long from the gaze of the public, he was then challenged to say whether India planned to revisit the 1974 agreement with Sri Lanka, and he said, well, look, it's a matter for the courts, and those courts, well, their most recent ruling on the question in 2013, the federal government actually told the Supreme Court that it couldn't, quote, retrieve Chakrabarti from Sri Lanka because, quote, no territory belonging to India was ceded nor sovereignty relinquished since the area was in dispute and had never been demarcated. So basically they were saying we didn't hand over something that was previously Indian property to Sri Lanka.
Agreed.
Yeah,
to give it to you.
Yeah, we just were like, well, there was some contention over this, and we will say that it's yours for that sake. So basically, India has no real claim over it.
Okay, so why are they talking about it, Suchandrika? If this is just a regional dispute about people who fish, why is this what Modi is talking about? And what does that tell us about the general election in India this year?
Okay, so Tamil Nadu is one of the first states to return their vote. So it will be a good win for him, for Modi, if he gets them. But also it does seem like, so he's been called like Teflon Man Modi. He's been in charge for a long time. He's been there through the pandemic and all sorts of riots and difficult things going on in India, and yet he's still there and he's likely to win. And it does seem that his foreign policy is what wins him the votes rather than what happens internally. So anything that's kind of served up to him that looks good, like him looking good in this situation, would just be a nice win for him. But really he's looking at UK relationships. The big ones are US relationships and sort of other ones with China and so on.
Yeah. What's your take, Julia, on how Modi's faring internally?
It's a good question. So in general, his popularity rating is pretty high at the moment, in the mid-70s. So it's predicted, and the polls are suggesting that he's fairly likely to win the election. But despite that, during his premiership, unemployment has risen. There have been further rising cases of attacks by Hindu nationalists on minority groups. And his leadership has also been marked by a real crackdown on dissent and free media. So as much as his popularity rating is doing well, there are real concerns over what a continuation of his leadership might mean. I mean, there's different factions and different groups within India who have specific issues of contention. But one that we were reporting on earlier in the year was also dissatisfaction from farmers in India, who are one of the biggest voting blocs. They've taken to the streets of India again in protest over agricultural reforms brought in by Modi, which they believe are harming them. And it's seen millions of people again take to the streets, more violence. So it's going to be an interesting one, but I think it's probably safe to say that Modi will win.
I mean, I guess in India in particular, Arion, it's just difficult, isn't it, to take a particular policy stance and say, like you might do in other countries, oh, he's trying to distract from this, when India is just so massive. I mean, I think people don't appreciate this is the biggest election of the year, isn't it, in the world? Give us a sense of the scale.
Yeah, exactly. It is so enormous. In fact, this year's Indian election has been called a democratic exercise that is completely unmatched in scale, both globally and also in history. So from the Himalayas in the north to the Indian Ocean in the south, and from some of the world's biggest cities to the smallest of villages, an estimated 969 million voters are eligible to cast their ballots. That's more than the population of all the countries of Europe combined. And together they'll cast their votes through 5.5 million electronic voting machines at 1 million polling stations. The Electoral Commission will deploy 15 million polling staff and security personnel to conduct the elections, so, more than the population of Sweden alone. And voting is going to run in 7 phases from April 19th to June the 1st. And it's expected to be the world's equal most expensive, so spending by political parties and candidates is likely to cost more than 1.2 trillion rupees, which is 14.4 billion US dollars, which is exactly the same amount as was spent on the US presidential and congressional races in 2020. So it's a huge deal and a very expensive one at that.
And what are the consequences going to be for the rest of the world, Suchandrika, whoever wins in the summer?
I think a really big one is looking at India's relationship with the US. I think that could have huge potential effects on lots of global relationships. Because India likes to kind of see itself as like, we're not in any one camp. They're friendly with Israel, but they're also sort of keeping friendly relations with Palestine, with Ukraine as well. They're kind of friendly with Ukraine, friendly with Russia, and they've got good reason to keep Russia and China from becoming best friends. So India's got sort of like fingers in lots of pies. But the US one is the biggest one. So obviously last time Trump was in, he and Modi have a couple of things in common, being sort of strongmen leaders and also anti-Muslim policies, which are really worrying. And some of the plans that Modi's government might have for the future could leave lots of Muslims in Bangladesh, for instance, stateless. So it is really concerning going forward what he might do with domestic policy. And some of those values can be reflected in what the Trump government has done. So if they're both in together, that is going to be quite worrying for a lot of us in the world, I think, looking at how that's going to affect people who don't have a lot of power. But also in terms of strategic friendships. In June 2023, the US and India put out a joint statement from both of them. And the language is really interesting. It's like, we've got a new level of trust and mutual understanding enriched by the warm bonds of family and friendship. So basically, they're besties, is what they're saying, just in a lot of language. So Biden also really wants to cultivate that friendship if he does get back in as well. He wants to keep India really close by, like the fastest growing power, they're outstripping China now. But also what you have is a lot of illiberal stuff that Western powers don't feel comfortable with that could be going on even further with another Modi government. So how far do you ignore that stuff but work with the economic power that's growing? It looks like US is saying, yeah, we'll go with it.
And what about their relationship with Sri Lanka, Julia? Has there been a response from that country to this dispute over Chakrabarti?
Yeah, so earlier this week, a Sri Lankan minister spoke to the Indian Express newspaper and said that Sri Lanka has not received any official communication from Indian authorities about control of the island. And they said that as far as Sri Lanka is concerned, Chakrabarti Island falls within the Sri Lankan line of control. So it sounds as if to Sri Lanka, it's a bit of a non-issue.
But also probably not something that either country wants to go to war over, Arion. Could you imagine a transfer of sovereignty from Sri Lanka to India ever being obtained realistically without a war?
No, and, this tough talk from K. Annamalai, the chief of the BJP in Tamil Nadu, who told reporters that the federal government is actively going to try to bring back Chakrabarti to protect the interests of, the local fishermen and women, just seems nonsense when you consider that in 2014, a former Attorney General of India who was representing Modi's government told the courts that if India wanted Chakrabarti, it would have to go to war to get it. Literally exactly what you've just said. And I don't think either country really are terribly interested in that. And I think this is all just really posturing from Modi. For decades, Tamil Nadu has resisted the BJP, and the party has managed to secure seats in both the Assembly and Parliament only through alliances down there. So I think that the important thing for Modi is to be seen to be being active in a region where otherwise he's showing little interest. He recently released this documentary where he claimed to have a relationship with the place, and it was completely picked up by meme merchants who are like, this is absolute nonsense and we see straight through what you're trying to do here. So, I don't think he's going to be successful on either count. So neither is he going to get his hands on the island, nor is he going to convince people in Tamil Nadu that suddenly the BJP is a great prospect.
Okay, thank you for that. Thank you for telling me all about an island I'd never heard of. Thank you for introducing me to a new collective noun, meme merchants. Arion, we're going to have more from you after this. Okay, Arion, your turn. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
This week we learnt that it's possible to go from prison to presidential palace in just 10 days.
Je suis conscient que les résultats sortis des urnes expriment un profond désir de changement.
I am aware that the results of the ballot box express a profound desire for systematic change. Through my election, the Senegalese people have committed themselves to building a fair Senegal, a prosperous Senegal, a progressing Africa.
Dans une Afrique en progrès.
Bassirou Diomaye Faye talking after being sworn in president of Senegal on Tuesday. Arion, your story of the week, what's happened?
Yeah, so Bassirou Diomaye Faye was sworn in, as you say, on Tuesday, just 10 days after being released from prison, which is astonishing in its own right. And he also became both Senegal's and also the continent of Africa's youngest ever president, even though he's never held any elected office before. But he still managed to sweep to a first-round victory in the election, which is also very rare in Senegal, which is usually decided by runoffs. And Faye's election is interesting on so many levels, but maybe the greatest of them all is what it means for democracy in the region and whether other countries might choose a democratic path over an authoritarian one, as Senegal has chosen to do here. And it also raises interesting questions, I think, about the relations between France and its former colonies.
Okay, Julia, what do we know about this man?
So Faye is a former tax investigator, and as Arion was saying, he hasn't held a position in leadership before, but he has got good history of political experience. He was a founding member of the PASTEF party in 2014, alongside Ousmane Sonko, who was his political mentor. And so Sonko was barred from running in the election. He was also imprisoned at the same time that Faye was.
For what, incidentally? Was it a completely trumped up charge?
Yes, basically. And it seems as if the charges were brought by the sitting president as a way of stemming opposition in the run-up to the election. So Faye was charged with defamation and contempt of court for criticising the government in a Facebook post. An amnesty law introduced earlier this year, or that came into effect earlier this year, meant that he was released in time for the election.
But Sonko wasn't allowed to stand, was he still?
No, he was barred from standing in the election after being convicted of defamation and also accusations of rape. But Sonko threw his support behind Faye very early on and really pushed him into the limelight. And so Faye has been described as a kind of accidental president in waiting as a result.
Yeah, they were kind of campaigning with a slogan that actually said, "I am Sonko. We're the same. Vote for me, you're voting for him."
Yeah, exactly that. He was just waiting in the wings and ready to step into the role.
And also, I don't know if this was an official campaign name, but people came to know him as Mr. Clean. Why, Suchandrika?
Because of his bleach empire. No, because he published a declaration of his assets and urged other candidates to do the same. And this got him nicknamed Mr. Clean by supporters. So he's been very transparent about what he actually owns and his interests. And so he wants everyone to be the same as him. And his supporters love that.
And how much of the vote for him was a vote for him, Arion, and his party, as opposed to a vote against the predecessor, Macky Sall, who's been in power for 12 years?
Yeah, so Macky Sall really came to be the embodiment of this gradual shift towards authoritarianism that seemed to be occurring in Senegal. And I think that they just managed to come back from the brink. But even so, Sall found himself being criticised for not only this lurch towards the jailing of his political rivals, but also the fact that youth unemployment rates have been going up, and there's a consequent related migration crisis where lots of people are basically leaving the country in record numbers in recent years. And more than 60% of Senegal's population is now under the age of 25. And Sall's popularity has just been sinking and sinking throughout his second term, basically because of his jailing of opposition members, but also because it wasn't clear whether he was going to stand down or not. And this started to fuel violence between protesters and gendarmes that led to more than 60 deaths since 2021. And again, Senegal has been this sort of unusual little island of comparative democracy and stability since its independence from France in 1960. And so for this violence to be emerging under Sall has really been associated with him as a leader. And I think a lot of the vote has been directly against him, even though he'd stood down and the candidate in his place was his own party's Amadou Ba. But he was promising to do more of the same. He was just promising to deliver the sort of continuity option. And I think people were like, actually, you don't want continuity. We want something different. It's
interesting, Julia. Arion mentioned the youth of the electorate, but I mean, he's not that young, Faye. He's 44. He's actually a year older than Rishi Sunak. So is this part of the youth quake in Africa that we've talked about before, really? Because if you had a representative leader, they'd be 10 years younger than he is.
Yeah, I thought that was very interesting as well, that he is the continent's youngest leader and yet he is older than Rishi Sunak. But I think it's important to place that in the context of leadership across the African continent. And there is kind of a trend across a lot of countries of much older leaders clinging onto power for decades. Paul Biya, who is the eldest head of state, is 91. The leaders of Zimbabwe, Equatorial Guinea, Ivory Coast are all in their 80s. So Faye does mark himself out as a particularly different case on the African continent. But as you were mentioning, the kind of youth quake that the continent is experiencing as well, Senegal, like Africa, is on the brink of this massive generational shift. The population of Africa is projected to double to 2.5 billion in the next 25 years. And that's in the context of other nations around the world, Japan, Italy, among some that I think we've discussed on this podcast before, really struggling with declining birth rates. Meanwhile, Africa is seeing a massive baby boom. But that also poses challenges, some that Faye is certain to encounter, with a very young and rapidly growing workforce. It's going to pose massive challenges in terms of resources, the economy, and just making sure that there are enough jobs that can help to reverse this trend of rising youth unemployment that Arion was mentioning.
And Suchandrika, what's his stance on the ties that Senegal has with France?
So as we heard earlier in the clip, Faye said at his actual official swearing in that there is a profound desire for systematic change. And one of those changes will be that he's promised to take the country out of the West African CFA franc, which is a currency that's pegged to the euro. And it's seen as a relic of French colonialism. So that'll be a really big sign that things are going to change in Senegal. So in other neighbouring countries that recently experienced military coups that did not have this kind of peaceful transfer of power like you have in Senegal, we're looking at Burkina Faso, Mali and Niger. They've really turned against France as well. It's definitely something that's happening across the continent, and the ruling juntas have ended military cooperation with France, and they're actually turning to Russia for support, which really seems to mark like a new phase.
But Arion, this could destabilise their currency, surely. Moving away from something pegged to the euro to something more independent, that's quite a turbulent thing to do.
Definitely, and I think that quite a lot of his promises on the face of them look full of potential and opportunity, but I think that inevitably he's now going to face a period where all of those policies are tested. And can he undo the shift that the country was going down towards corruption? Will his decoupling of the local currency from the euro have the effect that thereafter, or will it not? Will he even be able to work with the National Assembly, within which he doesn't, after all, have a majority? So he's going to have to look to build alliances to pass new laws or to call legislative elections. He's really going to have a lot of challenges on his desk when he gets there day one. And, the whole business of decoupling from France, arguably that's a thing that's already underway. Definitely Paris will have been watching this election very closely, and Macron sent his congratulations to Faye immediately after the results came out. But I think that France is attentive to the fact that all of its former colonies are shifting away from it. A common cry among demonstrators across the region is Français dégagé, or French out. That's a thing that people are saying all across the places that used to be colonies of France within Africa. So I think that there is this movement away from Europe and away from the close ties that Senegal used to have with its former colonial overlord. But I think that, whether it's going to be an easy ride for Faye is definitely still a very live question.
Could this be a catalyst for more shifts of power across the continent, Suchandrika, that don't involve violence?
So I've mentioned other countries that had that kind of French history, such as Burkina Faso, Mali and Niger, that had military coups. And what we have right now is Senegal has had a fourth peaceful transfer of power in 60 years since independence. It's looking good at the moment. But Faye's victory comes at its critical point where there is a gathering of opposition leaders from Angola, Uganda and Zimbabwe who are trying to address this surge in authoritarianism that's happening in a lot of countries across Africa. And so they do seem to be inspired by the fact that he's come to power in a sort of peaceful way. But it does seem, with all the changes he's interested in bringing in, will his administration be known for staying stable and peaceful? Possibly not if he's trying to change everything and change it as soon as possible. So it's full of hope right now, but it's hard to tell. He's got a lot of work to do, and it's quite tricky and it's quite complicated.
I suppose it depends, Julia, ultimately what the counterfactual would be, which of course we don't know. But the point is, since 1960, having had no military takeovers after independence from a colonial power, for the region is pretty impressive, isn't it? There's maybe cause for optimism there across the world.
Yeah, massively. And a lot of the commentary that I was reading about this was just so emphatic about how much of an achievement this is and how it truly is a sign of democracy, kind of a sense of reinvigoration in democracy and renewed faith in it. And that Senegal is quite a unique case, but it does give this hope that perhaps that it may be replicated in other countries as well.
Suchandrika.
So one thing I was looking at that seems to be worth mentioning is Transparency International publishes this Corruption Perceptions Index every year, and they look at which countries are doing well in terms of being perceived to be corrupt. And so Britain is, just to give you a sense, Britain is doing well. So you want to be a big number, right? You want to be near the bottom. And we're somewhere in the 70s. We're between like the Seychelles and Barbados, which is great. And you've got way up at the top, you've got like Somalia in at 11. So this is what we're talking about here. And so in terms of Senegal, it's 43. And so is Ghana. You've got South Africa at 41. So kind of in the middle, kind of doing well. But why this is important is that the senior writer, Kate Whiting at Transparency International, she says that corruption is hindering a lot of economic, political and social development throughout Africa. And it affects the well-being of individuals, families and communities and their trust in democracy as well. And so you have the situation in countries like Kenya, Malawi and Nigeria and Uganda, where 2/3 of people are worried of retaliation, are worried about retaliation if they speak up about corruption, about being unhappy with the government and so on. And so it could be that Faye sort of is a break with those problems, and it could be a greater trust in democratic process has come about with the fact that he's come in with this great story, inspirational story, and peacefully, because also the trust of the electorate in their government to bring about change, that's important too. That helps keeps things peaceful. And so Transparency International is kind of saying, look, there's hope here. They're doing well at the moment. The levels of corruption that are perceived here are quite low.
Okay, Suchandrika, you're up next after this. Suchandrika, it's over to you. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
To wash or not to wash? Why is that even a question?
You know me well enough. Do you think I give enough of a shit
He doesn't
about anything to bother spending any extra time on grooming whatsoever? I resent the fact I have to shower.
It's true, but he really does.
I sometimes go at least a week without showering.
That's your favourite little
Really?
treat. Yeah, he hates to be clean.
At least, so does Jane sometimes. We're like a couple of hamsters in their own straw in that bed.
You're filthy.
Yeah.
And so when was the last time you showered?
It was yesterday.
Yesterday. You didn't shower this morning?
No. Why bother doing it 2 days in a row? What's wrong with you?
TV personality Jonathan Ross and his daughter Honey speaking to Josh Widdicombe and Rob Beckett's podcast Parenting Hell last Friday. An audio moment that has provoked some conversation this week, Suchandrika.
So this episode came out last Friday, but the conversation throughout the media has been going on and on since then. So what happened was a famous man from the TV, Jonathan Ross, went on a podcast, and it does feel like he went on with his daughter as well. And it does feel as though this is banter, right? Like they started off this conversation with asking about dyeing his hair, and then he gets into like, I don't really shower, I only shower about once a week, my wife as well, Jane, who he mentions, and we just kind of live in this level of not cleanliness perhaps, and people have been triggered quite massively.
To have the discussion about how little per week is acceptable to shower, right? So there's a widespread acceptance that maybe every day isn't necessary, but then it's very difficult to find agreement beyond that. I mean, once a week feels too little.
So this is a kind of celebrity conversation that comes up every few years. The last time it came around is Ashton Kutcher and Mila Kunis sort of saying they don't, he was certainly saying he doesn't wash very often, he just does the essential bits. And they're saying about the children as well, unless you can see visible dirt on them, you don't need to wash them.
How do you do the essential bits without being in the shower in the first place?
I think washcloths were mentioned. We're getting very
Really?
like 19th century here, yeah.
Okay.
Maybe a butler, I don't know. But and then
Ashton Kutcher, famously impoverished, of course, can't afford a boiler.
Or like famously the guy in charge of a pranking show, so who can say like if it was that. But also there was around that time a conversation around the washing of one's legs, which I believe started on Black Twitter and then became like a conversation everywhere. And then it was like getting really into how people shower. And I don't know if we need that conversation. Maybe we do, because some people are doing it not enough.
I love a routine-based conversation.
You're going to ask us, aren't you? You're going to ask us. Yeah.
Thank you for correctly predicting my next question. Arion, how often do you shower? Living in a hotter nation, as we explained at the beginning of the show.
Well, this is the thing. So I shower daily, and I also make my kids get in the bath or in the shower every day. But this whole business that's come up in the wake of Jonathan Ross's comments and now all of the commentary that's spread across the media, and then the sort of analysis on how much you should or shouldn't shower or bathe per week, makes me wonder whether I'm doing it too frequently. And certainly at least one of the bits of research research that I read suggested that the kinds of things that kids do day to day in interacting with the world and getting a bit of muck and dirt all over them actually helps to build their bodies in such a way that, for example, mean that they're a bit more resistant to the development of allergies and so on. And I don't know if that is true or if it isn't, but it certainly made me worried that maybe my kids are certainly bathing a bit too regularly, and maybe me too. There's other stuff about whether, it has negative effects on your skin, and, dermatologists have been weighing in and saying actually it can be damaging and so on. So, yeah, I bathe every day, but maybe I shouldn't be.
Julia, how often do you shower? What an amazing job to have the license to ask a lady that.
Very much depends. Obviously, I've been exercising. I would shower every day, but I'm quite into not showering.
Okay. What kind of distance, though? But this is the thing. So that's an acceptable comment. It's what you say next, which might be unacceptable. How many days have you been between showering?
I would say I probably would just skip like one day.
Right.
I don't think I would. I don't think I could go a whole weekend without having a shower. Although actually, like a Friday and then a Monday morning shower is probably quite nice. I think, it's all like lots of commentators have been talking about this goblin mode, which is a word that started trending. Mode. Yeah, it's trending in 2022, and it refers to a type of behaviour which is unapologetically self-indulgent, lazy, slovenly, or greedy. And I just think we need to lean into that a little bit more. And I think the pandemic really gave everyone an excuse to, and it was almost like a space where you could experiment on that.
I was going to ask you about that because you're talking to us now from home, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Does working from home exacerbate the problem, if it is a problem, or the lifestyle, if you want to call it that, of not showering every day?
Yeah, I don't think it's a problem. Lifestyle choice. Yes, if I'm going into the office, I would probably make sure that I've showered. But if I know that I'm going to be working from home for a couple of days, haven't necessarily got plans in the evening, then as long as there's no major concerns about my general aroma, then yeah, I think it's fine not to shower.
Do you agree, Suchandrika? No noticeable odour and you're fine.
I think if you're working from home for a couple of days and you're not going anywhere, then that's fine. But I think if you're going somewhere, then you might want to shower. And then also, if you're coming back from somewhere, possibly. So yesterday, I've had my little niece in town. She's been in London for the first time. And she got the tube for the first time. And she looked up and said, "What's on my hands?" And there was sort of like bits of like grey black film that you get sometimes when you hold. So I think public transport. So I gave her hand sanitizer immediately and she was much happier. And just things, it's more bits like that, like just London's just dirty. So
yes, I did wonder the extent to which lifestyles play a part. Because Jonathan Ross is an interesting example, isn't he, Arion? Because it's sort of refreshing to hear a celebrity that they put absolutely no effort into their kind of wellness when that's such a huge industry. But at the same time, it's an interesting example because when you think of him actually being quite groomed with makeup and a sharp suit, presenting his chat show. And, he lives part of the time in Florida, as he went on to say in that podcast. It's a slightly different lifestyle to someone who's going in and out of an office and surrounded by people all the time.
Yeah, in that same segment, he confessed that he once went 2 weeks without washing in the US because he had been in a swimming pool, but then discovered that he was smelling really badly, and he decided that the only solution to ending this terrible bout of stinkiness was he tried washing himself, but then he couldn't get the stink off, and he had to shave his armpits, he reckons. I mean, it was at this stage that I thought maybe this is now a bit of a bit. But I do think it's interesting because you're right. I think that people would have been feeling as though this was someone who was subjected to all of the primping and preening that a human can be subjected to. And yet here he was confessing that he actually likes to lean into his own personal goblin mode. But listen, Olly, our listeners have been patiently sitting through what Julia and Suchandrika and I do in our bathrooms, but surely they are wanting to know what Olly Mann does. so
I'm a daily washer. If I know that I'm going to be having a bath in the evening, I have great pleasure of taking a bath in the evening. I will sometimes skip the shower in the morning. But there's daily application of water to my body. Does that answer your question?
It just sounds like a mealy-mouthed thing that a prosecutor would dig into further.
Olly, can we officially call you Mr. Clean?
Like Faye, yeah. The thing that I have been guilty of once was jumping into a swimming pool without having had a shower first. Because I know there's all the signs saying have a shower, but there is actually great pleasure, isn't there, in having not had a shower that day, going to the swimming pool and the first touch of water on your body being the refreshing swimming pool water. It's just incredibly inconsiderate of everyone else.
Did you also take a wee when you jumped in and take great pleasure in it?
That's obligatory. I feel this is getting derailed, Julia. Do you have some science? I mean, is there any benefit to not using cosmetics and soaps and stuff? Because that is the thing, isn't it, that does come up all the time. I do sometimes meet very beautiful people who tell me that their cleansing regime is nothing at all.
Oh, I think it's a flex, isn't it?
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, dermatologists, as Arion was saying, have said that it is not necessary to bathe every day, and that things like natural oils on the skin are really important for self-regulating, and we're probably all smothering ourselves in way more chemicals and things than we were years ago. I think also it's quite interesting reading around this. Someone pointed out that showering daily really is something that's only become commonplace in like the last 50, 60 years. For like most of human history, this really wasn't the norm. And so I think it also speaks to like a real change in our social habits and behaviors, but also just the level of social pressure that people feel like they're under. I don't know. I've been thinking about this more in terms of like natural deodorants and stuff like that as well. Like as people are kind of shifting from lots of chemicals and like thinking about their wellness routines and lifestyle choices, like actually are we going to see a bit of a shift as people decide they want to not go for such harsh chemicals and go back to kind of more natural ingredients and routines, and whether actually we're just going to be living in a slightly smellier but maybe happier world.
Yeah, well, that's true, isn't it? You were saying, Suchandrika, that it can be a bit of an assault on people, but actually, you know, if everyone's not showering, probably you wouldn't notice. I mean, I presume in 1600, when people were taking a bath once every 2 months, no one noticed.
What else do you want from medieval times? You can chuck the chamber pot out the window. I mean, how far are we going, guys? You clearly have never had to stand under a man's armpit on the tube.
Oh,
I'm 5'3", and I'm here for the rights of my people.
Yeah.
Yeah, the Times had an interesting piece from columnist Robert Crampton, who said that when he was growing up in the 70s, everyone bathed more like once a week. And he said this was in part because showers only became commonplace in the UK in the 80s. Plus, he said, about 50% of the population still smoked, so everything, he said, reeked of fags anyway, and coal and chip pan fires. And even so, he said, it was mostly a matter of money. And he says, quote, there was also a residual quasi-religious feeling that bathing was indulgent, vain, and unnecessary, and therefore sinful. And I can imagine that being a sort of motivation of a lot of people who, you know, like the thing of certain people's parents refusing to turn on the heating until a certain stage into winter because it's, you know, we should just put on an extra garment and suck it up. And I think that there is also a bit of a feeling of that among a certain generation, that maybe this is an unnecessary level of preening to be indulging in the first place.
There you are. Indulgent, vain and unnecessary. You can add your own review in Apple Podcasts. But for now, my thanks to Julia, Arion and Suchandrika. You can follow this show for free and get every episode as soon as it's released. Just search for The Week Unwrapped wherever you get your podcasts and tap follow. And you can also get 6 free issues of The Week magazine with the trial subscription if you go to theweek.co.uk/subscribe. In the meantime, I've been Olly Mann. Our music is by Tom Morby, the producer Ollie Peart at Rethink Audio. And until we meet again to unwrap next week, bye-bye.